In the kingdom of Valdoria, where mountains pierced the clouds and rivers ran silver beneath ancient stone bridges, there lived a princess whose name was whispered with reverence throughout the land. Princess Ilara was the only child of King Aldric and Queen Morgana, and from the moment of her birth she had been destined to wear the crown that had graced the heads of her ancestors for 300 years. The crown itself was a magnificent creation, wrought from gold mined in the deepest caverns of the northern mountains, studded with sapphires that gleamed like captured starlight, and topped with a single ruby the size of a dove's egg that was said to have been blessed by the first queen of Valdoria. Ilara had been raised in the palace, a sprawling edifice of white marble and soaring towers that dominated the capital city of Thornhaven, and she had been educated by the finest tutors in all matters befitting a future monarch, from statecraft and diplomacy to literature and the arts. Yet despite all the privileges of her station, despite the silken gowns and sumptuous feasts, despite the gardens where roses bloomed eternal and fountains sang their crystalline songs, there was a restlessness in Ilara's heart, a yearning for something beyond the gilded confines of her predetermined fate. The kingdom of Valdoria was prosperous and peaceful, its fields abundant with grain, its markets bustling with merchants from distant lands who came to trade spices and silks, precious metals and exotic curiosities. King Aldric was a just ruler, firm but fair, and his people loved him for the stability and security he provided. Queen Morgana was renowned for her grace and her charitable works, often visiting the poorest quarters of the city to distribute alms and comfort to the sick and suffering. Together, they had built a realm that was the envy of neighboring kingdoms, and their daughter was expected to carry on this legacy when her time came to rule. Ilara had always been dutiful, always obedient, attending endless council meetings and state dinners, learning the intricate dance of courtly politics, memorizing the genealogies of noble houses and the terms of treaties that stretched back generations. She performed her role with grace and intelligence, earning the admiration of her parents' advisors and the adoration of the common people who saw her ride through the streets in royal processions, her golden hair catching the sunlight like a halo, her smile bright and genuine despite the weight of expectation upon her shoulders. But on the eve of her 21st birthday, when the preparations for her coronation were already underway, and the entire kingdom buzzed with anticipation, something happened that would change the course of Ilara's life forever. It began with a dream, vivid and unsettling, in which she found herself walking through the bowels of the palace, descending stone staircases she had never seen before, following corridors that twisted and turned like the passages of a labyrinth. In her dream, she heard a voice calling to her, faint and desperate, echoing off damp walls that glistened with moisture in the flickering light of torches. The voice was masculine, raw with suffering, yet somehow still retaining a quality of nobility, and it spoke her name with such longing and urgency that she felt compelled to follow it deeper and deeper into the darkness. When she finally reached the source of the voice, she found herself standing before a heavy iron door set into the stone, and through the small barred window she could see a figure huddled in the shadows of a cell. A man so emaciated and filthy that he barely seemed human, yet his eyes, when they met hers, burned with an intensity that took her breath away. Ilara woke with a start, her heart pounding, her nightgown damp with perspiration despite the coolness of her chamber. She tried to dismiss the dream as nothing more than the product of an anxious mind, the result of the stress and pressure surrounding her impending coronation. But as the days passed, the dream returned again and again, always the same, always ending with those haunting eyes staring at her through the bars of that forsaken cell. She began to ask questions, carefully and discreetly at first, inquiring of the palace guards and servants about the dungeons beneath the castle. Most claimed to know nothing of any prisoners being held in the depths, insisting that the old dungeons had been sealed off decades ago, when King Uldric had reformed the justice system and abolished the practice of long-term imprisonment without trial. But there was one elderly servant, a woman named Agnes, who had worked in the palace since before Ilara was born, who grew pale and troubled when the princess pressed her for information. After much hesitation and with many fearful glances over her shoulder, Agnes finally admitted that there were indeed cells still in use far below the palace, cells that held prisoners whose existence was known only to the king and his most trusted guards, prisoners who had been forgotten by the world above and left to rot in darkness and silence. Driven by a compulsion she could not explain, Ilara resolved to find the dungeons and discover the truth behind her recurring dream. She waited until the dead of night, when the palace was quiet and the guards drowsy at their posts, and then she slipped from her chambers, wearing a simple cloak over her nightdress, carrying only a single candle to light her way. She moved through the familiar halls like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors, and then she found the staircase, exactly as it had appeared in her dreams, a narrow spiral of worn stone steps descending into the earth. The air grew colder as she descended, dank and heavy with the smell of mold and decay, and the walls closed in around her until she had to turn sideways to continue downward. At last, after what felt like an eternity of descent, she emerged into a corridor lined with cells, most of them empty and open, their doors hanging from rusted hinges. But at the very end of the passage, she saw the door from her dream, massive and forbidding, sealed with a lock that looked as old as the castle itself. With trembling hands, Ilara raised her candle to the barred window and peered inside, and what she saw made her cry out in horror and pity. There, chained to the wall in a cell that was barely large enough for him to lie down, was a man who appeared to be more corpse than living being. His hair was long and matted, his beard wild and unkempt, his body covered in rags that had once been clothing but were now little more than strips of rotting fabric. His skin was pale as parchment, stretched tight over bones that pressed against it like the framework of a collapsed tent, and his limbs were marked with scars and sores that spoke of years of neglect and suffering. But when he lifted his head at the sound of her voice and their eyes met, Ilara saw the same burning intelligence and desperate hope that had haunted her dreams, and she knew with absolute certainty that she could not turn away from this man, could not leave him to die alone in the darkness. She called out to him, her voice shaking, asking who he was and why he was imprisoned here. For a long moment he did not respond, as though he could not quite believe that another human being was actually speaking to him, that he was not simply experiencing another cruel hallucination conjured by his tormented mind. Then, slowly, painfully, he dragged himself closer to the door, and in a voice that was little more than a hoarse whisper, he told her his name. He was Sir Damon Blackwood, a knight who had once served her father with honor and distinction, a hero of the wars that had secured Valdoria's borders and brought peace to the realm. He had been imprisoned 15 years ago, accused of treason and conspiracy against the crown, charges that he swore were false, the result of political machinations and the jealousy of rivals who had sought to destroy him. He had been given no trial, no chance to defend himself or present evidence of his innocence, but had simply been dragged from his bed in the middle of the night and thrown into this cell, where he had languished ever since, forgotten by everyone except the silent guards who brought him just enough food and water to keep him alive, tormented by the knowledge that the world above had moved on without him, and that he would die here, alone and unmourned, his name forever tainted by accusations he had never had the chance to refute. Ilara listened to his story with growing horror and anger, unable to comprehend how such an injustice could have occurred in her father's kingdom, under her father's rule. She wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a madman, to convince herself that he must be guilty of the crimes for which he had been imprisoned. But something in his voice, in the quiet dignity with which he spoke despite his degradation, convinced her that he was telling the truth. She demanded to know more, to understand the details of his alleged crimes and the circumstances of his imprisonment. And Demon, starved for human contact after so many years of isolation, told her everything. He had been part of a faction at court that had opposed a particular policy of the king's, a trade agreement with a neighboring kingdom that Demon and others had believed would ultimately prove detrimental to Valdoria's interests. They had voiced their concerns openly and honorably, presenting their arguments before the royal council and seeking to persuade the king to reconsider his position. But there had been others at court, sycophants and manipulators who saw an opportunity to eliminate their rivals, and they had whispered poison in the king's ear, twisting innocent opposition into treasonous conspiracy, turning honest debate into evidence of sedition. One by one, Demon's allies had been arrested, accused of plotting to overthrow the throne and replace King Aldrich with a puppet ruler who would serve their interests. Most had been exiled, their lands and titles stripped from them, but Demon, as the supposed ringleader of the conspiracy, had been singled out for special punishment. He was to be made an example, a warning to anyone who might dare to question the king's authority. But rather than executing him publicly and making him a martyr, the king had chosen a crueler fate, erasing him from existence, burying him alive in these dungeons where he could be forgotten, where his name would fade from memory and his supposed crimes would become nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power. Demon had spent 15 years in this cell, 15 years of darkness and silence, broken only by the occasional visit from guards who never spoke to him, who treated him as less than human, as a thing to be kept alive but never acknowledged. He had watched himself waste away, had felt his mind begin to fracture under the weight of isolation and despair. And yet somehow, through sheer force of will, he had managed to hold on to his sanity, clinging to the faint hope that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light and justice would be served. Ilara returned to her chambers that night with her mind in turmoil, unable to reconcile the father she knew, the just and honorable king beloved by his people, with the man who could condemn an innocent knight to such a horrible fate. She told herself that there must be more to the story. The demon must have committed some crime so terrible that it justified his punishment. But she could not shake the image of those haunted eyes, could not forget the quiet dignity with which he had spoken of his suffering. For days she was distracted and distant, going through the motions of her royal duties, while her thoughts remained in that dark cell far below the palace. Her parents noticed the change in her demeanor and attributed it to nerves about the upcoming coronation, offering her reassurances and attempting to ease her anxieties, but their kindness only made her feel worse, deepening the sense of betrayal and confusion that gnawed at her heart. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Ilara decided to confront her father directly. She waited until they were alone in his study, surrounded by maps and documents of state, and then she asked him about Sir Damon Blackwood, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition or guilt. The king's expression darkened immediately, and for a moment Ilara saw something in his eyes that frightened her, a flash of anger and perhaps of shame. He demanded to know how she had learned that name, who had spoken to her of matters that were long settled and best forgotten, and when she admitted that she had discovered the dungeons and spoken to Demon herself, the king's fury was terrible to behold. He forbade her from ever returning to those cells, insisted that Demon was a traitor who had gotten exactly what he deserved, and warned her that if she persisted in this foolishness, she would jeopardize not only her coronation, but the stability of the entire kingdom. But even as he raged at her, Ilara saw the doubt in his eyes, saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk, and she realized that her father was not simply angry at her disobedience, but was terrified that she had uncovered a secret that he had worked for 15 years to keep buried. That night, Ilara made a decision that would change her life forever. She could not, in good conscience, accept the crown and become Queen of Valdoria, while knowing that an innocent man suffered in the dungeons below the palace, that the kingdom she would rule was built on a foundation of injustice and lies. She understood that if she pursued this matter, if she demanded that Demon be given a fair hearing and a chance to prove his innocence, she would be setting herself against her father and the entire established order of the realm. She knew that there would be consequences, that she might lose everything she had been raised to believe was her birthright, but she also knew that she could not live with herself if she simply turned away and pretended that she had never seen what she had seen, never heard Demon's story. The crown that awaited her was a magnificent thing, a symbol of power and prestige that any other woman in the kingdom would have coveted beyond measure. But to Ilara, it had become a shackle, a golden chain that bound her to a legacy she could no longer accept. She returned to the dungeons, this time bringing with her not just a candle, but food and water, clean clothing and medical supplies. She tended to Demon's wounds as best she could through the bars of his cell, washing away years of filth and applying salves to his sores, speaking to him gently and treating him with the dignity and respect that had been denied him for so long. Over the following weeks, she visited him every night, gradually nursing him back to some semblance of health, listening to his stories of his life before his imprisonment, of the campaigns he had fought and the friends he had lost, of the simple joys of sunlight and fresh air and human companionship that he had been denied for 15 years. As she came to know him, Ilara found herself developing a profound admiration for this man who had endured such suffering without losing his essential humanity, who still possessed kindness and honor despite everything that had been done to him. She began to understand that Demon represented something fundamental about justice and mercy, about the responsibility of those in power to those who have no power. And she realized that her decision about what to do next would define not just her own character, but the kind of ruler she would become if she ever did ascend to the throne. The day of her coronation arrived, with all the pomp and ceremony that such an occasion demanded. The great cathedral of Thornhaven was packed with nobles and dignitaries from across the kingdom and beyond, all dressed in their finest garments, all eager to witness the moment when Princess Ilara would become Queen Ilara and take her place in the long line of Valdorian monarchs. The crown sat on a velvet cushion before the altar, gleaming in the light of 1,000 candles, and the archbishop stood ready to perform the sacred ritual that would bind Ilara to her destiny. Her parents sat in places of honor, her father resplendent in his ceremonial robes, her mother beautiful and proud, both of them beaming with satisfaction at the culmination of all their plans and hopes. The assembled crowd fell silent as Ilara entered the cathedral, walking slowly down the long aisle in a gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread, her golden hair unbound and flowing down her back in the traditional manner of a virgin queen about to assume her throne. Every eye was upon her, every breath held in anticipation as she approached the altar and knelt before the archbishop. But instead of bowing her head to receive the crown, Ilara rose to her feet and turned to face the assembled crowd. In a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the cathedral, she announced that she could not, in good conscience, accept the crown while an innocent man languished unjustly in the dungeons of the palace. She told the story of Sir Damon Blackwood, of his years of suffering and his unheard protestations of innocence. And she declared that before she could become queen, this wrong must be righted and justice must be served. The cathedral erupted in shocked whispers and gasps of disbelief, and Ilara saw her father's face turn crimson with rage, saw her mother's hand fly to her mouth in horror. The archbishop looked confused and uncertain, unsure whether to proceed with the ceremony or to halt it, and the nobles in attendance began to murmur among themselves, some expressing outrage at this unprecedented disruption of tradition, others intrigued by the drama unfolding before them. King Aldric rose from his seat, his voice thundering through the cathedral as he commanded his daughter to cease this madness and complete the ceremony as planned. He declared that she was hysterical, that she had been deceived by the lies of a condemned traitor, and he ordered the guards to escort her from the cathedral so that the coronation could proceed without further interruption. But Ilara stood her ground, refusing to be silenced or intimidated, and she turned to address not her father, but the people assembled before her, appealing to their sense of justice and their belief in the principles upon which Valdoria had been founded. She reminded them that their kingdom prided itself on being a realm of law and order, where even the lowliest peasant had the right to a fair trial and the opportunity to defend themselves against accusations, and she asked how they could celebrate the coronation of a new queen while allowing such a fundamental violation of justice to stand unchallenged. Her words struck a chord with many in the audience, particularly among the common people who had been allowed to observe the ceremony from the back of the cathedral, and a growing murmur of support began to ripple through the crowd. Seeing that the situation was spiraling out of control, Queen Morgana intervened, approaching her daughter with tears in her eyes and begging her to reconsider, to think of the chaos and uncertainty that would result from this rash action. She reminded Ilara of all the responsibilities that came with the crown, all the people who depended on the stability and continuity of the monarchy, and she pleaded with her to put aside her personal feelings and do her duty to the kingdom. For a moment, Ilara wavered, moved by her mother's obvious distress and the weight of all those expectations. But then she thought of Demon chained in his cell, thought of the 15 years he had lost, thought of all the other injustices that might be hidden in the shadows of the kingdom, if those in power were never held accountable for their actions. She embraced her mother, kissed her gently on the cheek, and then she removed the simple circlet she wore as a princess, the symbol of her royal status, and placed it on the altar beside the crown she would never wear. In that moment, she ceased to be Princess Ilara of Valdoria and became simply Ilara, a woman choosing her own path regardless of the cost. The aftermath of that day was tumultuous and painful. King Aldric, humiliated and enraged, initially refused to even discuss the matter of Demon's imprisonment, insisting that Ilara had thrown away her birthright for nothing and that she was no longer welcome in the palace. But Ilara's dramatic stand had captured the imagination of the people, and word of her sacrifice spread quickly through the kingdom, transforming her from a distant royal figure into a symbol of justice and integrity. Ballads were written about the princess who gave up her crown for the sake of a forgotten prisoner, and public pressure began to mount for the king to address the accusations she had made. Nobles who had their own grievances against the crown, who had seen friends and allies destroyed by the machinations of court politics, began to voice their support for a full investigation into the circumstances of Demon's imprisonment. The king's advisors, recognizing that the situation had become a threat to the stability of the realm, counseled him to relent and allow Demon's case to be reviewed, arguing that the appearance of justice being served would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the crown's authority. Reluctantly, grudgingly, King Aldric finally agreed to convene a special tribunal to examine the evidence against Sir Demon Blackwood and determine whether his imprisonment had been justified. The proceedings were held in the great hall of the palace, open to all who wished to attend, and they became the most sensational event in living memory. Demon was brought forth from his cell, and though Elara had done her best to restore him to health, he was still a shadow of the knight he had once been, gaunt and scarred and visibly weakened by his long ordeal. But he stood before the tribunal with his head held high, refusing to be cowed or diminished by his suffering, and he spoke with eloquence and passion about the circumstances of his arrest and the injustice of his imprisonment. Documents were produced, witnesses were called, and gradually the truth began to emerge. The conspiracy that Demon had supposedly led had been largely fabricated, built on misinterpreted conversations and testimony extracted under duress from men who had been threatened with similar fates if they did not cooperate. The real architects of the plot against Demon were revealed to be a cabal of courtiers who had used the king's paranoia and desire for absolute control to eliminate their rivals and consolidate their own power. The king himself was called to testify, and it was a moment that no one present would ever forget. King Aldric, who had ruled Valdoria for 30 years with unquestioned authority, was forced to confront the consequences of his actions and admit that he had allowed his judgment to be clouded by fear and manipulation. He acknowledged that he'd been too quick to believe the accusations against Demon, too willing to see conspiracy where there had been only honest disagreement, and too proud to admit his mistake, even when doubt had begun to creep into his mind. It was a humbling moment, and some saw it as evidence of the king's fundamental decency that he was willing to confess his errors publicly, while others viewed it as a sign of weakness that would forever tarnish his legacy. The tribunal concluded that Demon had been wrongfully imprisoned and that he was innocent of all charges against him, and they ordered his immediate release and the restoration of his titles, lands, and honors. Moreover, they recommended that the king establish new safeguards to prevent such abuses of power in the future, including guarantees of due process and the right to a fair trial for all subjects, regardless of their station. Demon's release was greeted with celebration throughout the kingdom, and he emerged from the palace a free man for the first time in 15 years, blinking in the sunlight that he had not seen for so long, breathing deeply of the fresh air that tasted like the sweetest wine. Elara was there to greet him, and when they embraced, there was not a dry eye among the crowd that had gathered to witness this moment of redemption and justice. In the days and weeks that followed, Demon worked to rebuild his life, reclaiming what remained of his estates and reconnecting with the few friends and family members who had not forgotten him during his imprisonment. He found that the world had changed in his absence, that the young knights he had once commanded were now old men, that the king he had served was now approaching the end of his reign, and that the kingdom itself had evolved in ways both good and ill. But through all of this adjustment and rediscovery, there was one constant in his life, one anchor that kept him grounded and gave him hope for the future, and that was Elara. The bond that had formed between them during those clandestine visits in the dungeon, that connection forged in darkness and sustained by courage and compassion, had grown into something deeper and more profound. Elara had sacrificed everything for Demon, had given up her crown and her place in the royal succession, had set herself against her father and risked the stability of the kingdom, all because she believed in his innocence and could not stand by while an injustice was perpetuated. That kind of loyalty and integrity was rare in any context, but especially in the world of courtly politics, where expediency and self-interest usually prevailed, and Demon found himself falling in love with this remarkable woman who had saved him not just from physical imprisonment, but from the despair and hopelessness that had threatened to consume his soul. Elara, for her part, discovered in Demon a kindred spirit, a man who valued honor and principle above personal gain, who had endured unimaginable suffering without surrendering his essential humanity, and who understood the true meaning of justice in a way that few others in her life ever had. They spent long hours together, walking in the gardens of estates that Demon was reclaiming, talking about philosophy and ethics, sharing their dreams and fears, slowly healing the wounds that life had inflicted upon them both. But their happiness was tempered by the complicated situation in which they found themselves. Ilara was no longer a princess, having renounced her claim to the throne and her position in the royal family. But neither was she simply a common citizen, being still the daughter of the king and a figure of enormous symbolic importance to the people of Valdoria. Demon had been restored to his former status as a knight and lord, but his years of imprisonment had left him physically diminished and socially isolated, no longer the vigorous warrior he had once been, and uncertain of his place in a world that had moved on without him. They both bore scars, visible and invisible, and they both faced uncertain futures in a kingdom that was still coming to terms with the revelations about the king's actions and the failings of the justice system. King Aldric, chastened by the tribunal but still proud and stubborn, had not forgiven his daughter for her public defiance, and though he had been forced to acknowledge his mistake regarding Demon, he made it clear that Ilara was no longer welcome at court, and that any relationship between her and the former prisoner would be viewed with extreme disfavor by the crown. Despite these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, Ilara and Demon's relationship deepened and flourished. They found solace in each other's company, creating a private world where the judgments and expectations of others could not reach them, where they could simply be two people who had found unexpected love in the aftermath of injustice and suffering. Demon proved to be a patient and devoted partner, never pressuring Ilara to define their relationship or commit to a future together, understanding that she needed time to process everything that had happened and to discover who she was, now that she was no longer defined by her royal identity. Ilara, in turn, helped Demon reconnect with the world, introducing him to new friends, encouraging him to pursue interests and passions that he had set aside during his years of imprisonment, reminding him that his life was not over but was in fact beginning anew with possibilities he had never imagined. As the months passed, the kingdom gradually settled into a new equilibrium. King Aldric, recognizing that his health was failing and that his credibility had been permanently damaged by the Demon affair, announced that he would abdicate the throne in favor of his nephew, a capable young man who had been serving as governor of the northern provinces and who had a reputation for fairness and progressive thinking. This decision was welcomed by most of the nobility and the common people alike, who felt that it was time for new leadership and a fresh start after the tumultuous events of recent months. The new king, who took the name Aldric II in honor of his uncle, but made it clear that he intended to rule with a very different style, immediately set about implementing reforms to the justice system and creating new institutions to protect the rights of all subjects. He also reached out to Ilara, offering to restore her title and position if she wished, but she politely declined, explaining that she had found a new purpose in life and did not regret the choice she had made. That purpose became clear when Ilara announced her intention to marry Sir Damon Blackwood, a decision that surprised no one who had observed their relationship, but which still caused considerable controversy in certain circles. There were those who argued that such a union was inappropriate, that the daughter of a king should not marry a man who had been imprisoned as a traitor, regardless of his subsequent exoneration, and that Ilara was debasing herself by choosing a partner so far beneath her original station. But there were many more who saw the marriage as a beautiful conclusion to a story of justice and redemption, a testament to the power of love and integrity to triumph over prejudice and political expediency. The wedding was held, not in the grand cathedral where Ilara's coronation had been scheduled, but in a simple country chapel on Demon's estate, attended by a small gathering of friends and well-wishers, with none of the elaborate ceremony and pageantry that would have accompanied a royal wedding, but with infinitely more genuine joy and celebration. In the years that followed, Ilara and Demon built a life together that was rich in purpose and meaning, even if it lacked the grandeur and power of the life she had been born to lead. They used Daemon's restored wealth and Ilara's influence to establish charitable institutions throughout the kingdom, creating shelters for the poor, schools for children who otherwise would have had no access to education, and legal aid services for those who could not afford to defend themselves in court. They became advocates for prison reform, working tirelessly to ensure that no one else would suffer the kind of injustice that Daemon had endured, pushing for laws that guaranteed due process and humane treatment for all prisoners, regardless of their alleged crimes. Ilara discovered that she was far more fulfilled working directly to help people and address injustices than she ever would have been sitting on a throne making policy decisions from a distance. And Daemon found that his years of suffering had given him a unique perspective and credibility that made him an effective voice for the voiceless and the forgotten. They had children, 3 in all, whom they raised with values of compassion and justice, teaching them that true nobility came not from titles or bloodlines, but from character and actions, from the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Their eldest daughter, whom they named Morgana after Ilara's mother, with whom she had eventually reconciled, grew up to become a brilliant jurist, reforming the legal codes of Valdoria and establishing principles of justice that would influence jurisprudence throughout the known world. Their son, named Aldrich after his grandfather but possessing none of that man's authoritarian tendencies, became a knight renowned not for his prowess in battle, but for his diplomatic skills and his ability to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. Their youngest child, a daughter they named Hope because she represented everything they had fought for and everything they believed the future could be, dedicated her life to education and the arts, founding institutions of learning that welcomed students from all backgrounds and all levels of society, breaking down the barriers that had traditionally limited access to knowledge and culture to Edley the wealthy and privileged. As Ilara and Daemon grew older together, watching their children flourish and their kingdom transform in ways both large and small, they often reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them together. Ilara never regretted her decision to give up the crown, never mourned the life of privilege and power she had rejected, because she knew that she had gained something infinitely more valuable in exchange. She had gained the knowledge that she was true to herself and her principles, that she had made a difference in the life of at least one person who desperately needed someone to believe in him, and that she had helped to create a more just and compassionate society for future generations. She had gained love, real and deep and transformative, the kind of love that only comes when two people see each other truly and completely and choose each other freely without the distortions of duty or expectation. She had gained freedom, the freedom to define her own identity and purpose, to live according to her own values rather than the dictates of tradition and social convention. Daemon, for his part, never forgot the darkness of his imprisonment, or the hopelessness that had nearly destroyed him during those 15 years of isolation and suffering. But he also never forgot the moment when he had looked up through the bars of his cell and seen Ilara's face illuminated by candlelight, her eyes full of compassion and determination, and he had realized that he was not forgotten after all, that someone cared about his fate and was willing to risk everything to help him. That moment had saved his life in every sense that mattered, had given him back not just his freedom, but his faith in humanity, and his belief that goodness and justice could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. He devoted the rest of his life to being worthy of the sacrifice Ilara had made for him, to honoring her courage and integrity by living with the same principles and dedication to justice that she had demonstrated when she stood up in that cathedral and refused to accept the crown. Their story became legend in Valdoria, passed down through generations, transformed by time and retelling into a tale of mythic proportions. In some versions, Ilara was portrayed as an almost supernatural figure, an angel of mercy who descended into hell to rescue a damned soul, while Demon became a noble martyr who endured his suffering with saintly patience. In other versions, the political and personal complexities were emphasized, turning the story into a meditation on power and justice, on the corruption of institutions and the courage required to challenge them. But in all versions, the central truth remained the same. The truth that a young woman had been willing to give up everything she had been promised, everything she had been raised to desire and expect, in order to right a terrible wrong and save a man who had no one else to speak for him. And that truth, more than any crown or any throne, was what made Elara truly royal, truly worthy of the admiration and love of her people. The old king, Aldric, lived long enough to see how the story ended, long enough to witness the happiness of his daughter and the redemption of the man he had wronged. And in his final years, he privately admitted to Elara that she had been right to do what she did, that her refusal to accept the crown had been not an act of rebellion, but an act of profound loyalty to the true principles of leadership and justice. He told her that she would have made a magnificent queen, but that she had become something even better, a conscience for the kingdom, and a reminder that no institution or individual, no matter how powerful, was above accountability or beyond the reach of moral judgment. It was as close to an apology as he was capable of giving, and Elara accepted it with grace and forgiveness, understanding that her father had been as much a victim of the system he had created as anyone else, trapped by his own pride and the expectations of his role into making decisions that haunted him for the rest of his life. When Elara and Demon were very old, sitting together in the garden of their estate on a warm summer evening, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much history and so many lives, they talked about what they would want people to remember about them after they were gone. Demon said he hoped people would remember that it was possible to survive even the worst injustice without losing your humanity, that suffering could be endured and overcome, and that it was never too late for redemption or for a new beginning. Elara said she hoped people would remember that some things were more important than power or privilege, that true leadership meant being willing to sacrifice your own interests for the sake of what was right, and that love and justice were not abstract ideals, but living principles that required constant courage and commitment to uphold. They agreed that if their story inspired even one person to stand up against injustice, to choose compassion over convenience, to value integrity over advantage, then everything they had been through, all the pain and loss and struggle, would have been worth it. The crown that Elara had refused to wear remained in the royal treasury, displayed behind glass as a historical artifact and a reminder of the day when a princess had chosen justice over power. New kings and queens were crowned with that same crown in the centuries that followed, and each one was told the story of Princess Elara and Sir Demon Blackwood, reminded of the responsibility that came with the privilege of ruling, warned against the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability and justice for all. The story became part of the fabric of Valdorian identity, a founding myth that helped shape the kingdom's values and institutions, ensuring that the lessons Elara and Demon had fought so hard to teach would not be forgotten by future generations. And in that way, Elara did end up ruling Valdoria after all, not from a throne, but from the hearts and minds of her people, not through edicts and decrees, but through the power of her example and the enduring relevance of her choice. In the end, the question of whether Elara made the right decision when she gave up the crown for the life of a forgotten prisoner can only be answered by looking at what came after, at the lives that were changed and the injustices that were prevented, at the love that flourished, and the children who carried forward the values their parents had lived by. By any meaningful measure, by any standard that values human dignity and moral courage over wealth and status, the trade was a bargain, the crown exchanged for something infinitely more precious. Ilara lived a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by love and respect, knowing that she had made a real difference in the world and that she had been true to herself and her principles. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, with Demon holding her hand, and their children and grandchildren gathered around her bed. And her last words were reportedly a simple statement of gratitude for the life she had been given and the choices she had been allowed to make. Demon survived her by only 3 months, dying of what the physicians said was a broken heart, but what everyone who knew them understood was simply the completion of a bond that could not be severed even by death. They were buried together in the chapel where they had married, beneath a simple stone that bore their names and a single line of inscription that Ilara herself had composed years earlier in anticipation of this moment. The inscription read, "She chose justice over power, he chose honor over despair, and together they proved that love is the greatest crown of all." And so, the story of the princess who traded the crown for the life of a forgotten prisoner came to its conclusion. But its influence and its message lived on, passed down through the ages as a testament to the enduring power of compassion and courage, a reminder that the truest measure of our humanity is not what we gain, but what we are willing to sacrifice for the sake of others, not the power. We accumulate but the justice we serve, not the crowns we wear, but the lives we touch and the love we give. The kingdom of Valdoria flourished for many centuries after Ilara and Demon were gone, and though it faced challenges and changes like all human institutions, it never forgot the lesson that a young princess had taught it on the day she refused to be crowned, the lesson that some things are more important than power, and that the true purpose of leadership is not to rule over others, but to serve justice and protect the vulnerable, and ensure that no one, no matter how powerless or forgotten, is left to suffer in darkness without hope or help. If you enjoyed this story of sacrifice, love, and justice, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more medieval tales that will transport you to worlds of honor, courage, and redemption. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us, what would you have done in Ilara's position? Would you have given up the crown for the sake of justice? Or would you have chosen the path of power and tried to reform the system from within? What does this story teach us about leadership and moral courage in our own times? Share your thoughts and let's continue this conversation together, because these timeless stories only have meaning when we engage with them and apply their lessons to our own lives and our own world.